They cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He sent out the word and healed them, and he rescued them from the grave. He let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind.
You can be seated. Thank you. I can't say that I ever actually did it as a child, but I think there are a couple of times along the way I probably thought about running away when I thought mom or dad was being a little bit mean. I found a good collection of notes on the internet from children who decided to run away, so I wanted to share a few of these with you. One note says, "By the time you read this, I might be leaving. If you want to see me again, I will be at the first McDonald's that you see when you go right from our house. I love you." Let's see the next one. "Dear Mom and Dad, I ran away. I'll be back soon. Love, Joey." And there's a little PS at the bottom. "It's all Mom's fault." Just so you know. I like this one. This is a front and back. "Dear Mom and Dad, family, I got really mad and I ran away, signed Meg." And on the back it says, "PS, I might come back." This is one of my favorites. I love the creative spelling on this one. I know it's a little hard to see. It says, "I'm running away, UWA, away, because you wouldn't let me have the ball." So, some creative spelling. "I'm running away because you wouldn't let me have the ball." And here's my favorite one. "Mom, I ran away, not because you're mean or anything. I only wanted to meet the Spice Girls." So, probably dates that note to some degree, but thinking about children who decide to run away from their parents. Now, there's a certain age at which that becomes a more serious matter. But when you're talking about children who are barely old enough to read and write, it's kind of a laughable thing, isn't it? I don't think any of you are having genuine experiences of fear and terror as I'm showing you these little notes from a child who gets a little angry and says, "Well, I think I'm going to leave," because you want to start asking the questions. Where exactly do you think you're going to go? Well, one says, "I guess I'm going to head down to McDonald's, and I hope that McDonald's would keep them around for a while." How are you going to pay for all the things that you need? How are you going to get places? Where are you going to sleep? What are you going to do to protect yourself, provide for yourself? So it becomes kind of a laughable matter when a little child thinks they're going to run away from mom and dad, because we all know good and well this can't possibly last very long until they probably get scared or spend the $5 that they had and have to come back needing someone to help them find a little bit more. But just the same, are we really any different than that when we make up our minds and say, "I'm going to run away from God. I don't like what God is doing. I don't like the way the world is operating, and I think I'm just going to go this one on my own for a while." God sometimes does allow us to run. God doesn't force us to love Him. He doesn't force us to respond to Him the way that we ought to. He respects us too much for that. God lets us make our own decisions in how we will or won't respond to Him, and so He does allow us to run if we choose to. But when we run, and we decide to experience the absence of God, it can be a pretty unhappy place. This was Jonah's experience, wasn't it? Jonah decided to run from God, and it wasn't too long at all until this experience of running from God was not a place that he wanted to stay. Things got bad quickly. But if you decide in your life that you're going to try and reject God's rule over you, there are several things that suddenly you have to do, just like we might ask the child those questions. How are you going to provide for yourself? What are you going to do? If you've decided that you're going to reject God's presence in your life and His rightful rule over your life, suddenly you have all the stress that's involved in needing to prove yourself, don't you? If you want to have any meaning to your life, any lasting significance to what you've done, as Christians, we rely on God to provide that. Well, if you want to leave God out of the picture, it all kind of falls on your shoulders. It's a pretty heavy burden to bear, isn't it? Can you even really afford to sleep if it's all dependent on you to prove yourself in this life? You also have to depend on other people to validate you. You can't establish yourself on your own. You need other people to say great things about you and to appreciate you and to acknowledge you. And so you're kind of dependent on this never-ending cycle of seeking people's approval. And after all, people are very fickle, aren't they? That's a very hungry place you're going to stay if you're relying on people to give you your validation and not God, who gives it so lavishly. It's also the case in life that if you're going to go this entirely on your own without God, you actually have to be strong enough to endure anything that life throws your direction. Whatever challenges life gives you, somehow you have to find a way to be stronger than them. And what's the secret there? You won't be, will you? You're not. There's a lot of things that life throws your way that are more than you can handle, that you won't be able to achieve or accomplish on your own. And so we think about Jonah. He receives a word from the Lord to go and preach to Nineveh, and we've talked in past weeks about how awful the Assyrian Empire was and the way that it treated the people that it conquered. But just the same, Jonah decides to disobey the word of the Lord. He decides he's going to run from God in the opposite direction, and he doesn't last any time at all, does he? Not any time at all. Where we left off last week, the mariners had been pleading with God in this terrible storm that once Jonah said, the only way to stop the storm is to throw me overboard. They're pleading with God not to hold them accountable for his blood. You see this great piety and sincerity and moral character in these foreign mariners who had been worshiping other gods, whereas the prophet of God is the one who's not listening to the word of the Lord and wanting to run from God. So at his direction, and when they saw they had no other options, they toss him overboard, and of course, the storm calms down. And the text says that the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah. And we would regard this as somewhat of a miraculous account, wouldn't we? God appoints this fish to show up and do this thing nobody would have ever seen coming. Jonah thought he was simply going to drown. The mariners probably thought Jonah was going to drown. But this is a situation in history where God has intervened. And usually when God does something to intervene in your life, it's because you need to learn something, isn't it? When you had something that really got twisted and turned upside down and something that really took you off guard in life, usually, with time, with reflection, with a lot of prayer, with companionship from your fellow Christians, you can look at those hard circumstances and find that there was something you could learn from all of this. There's some deeper understanding to be gained. And fortunately, just the way that Jonah has much to learn, God has much patience. God shows him a lot of patience. A lot of people would tell you that in life, we have to reach the end of what we're able to do so that we can understand that it has only ever been God who sustains us both in the good times and the bad times. We would talk about this and call it hitting rock bottom. Just like the prodigal son who ran away and finally got to the worst place he'd ever been, where he felt like he couldn't go any lower, and it says he came to his senses. It's a rock bottom moment where suddenly you come to your senses. Jesus himself said you have to lose your life in order to find it. You have to get to the point where you have nothing left but God to appreciate just how God was the only thing you really needed all along. There are a lot of people who have stories of hitting rock bottom. One of my favorites is the author J.K. Rowling, who, of course, wrote all the Harry Potter books. But she gave a commencement speech at Harvard in 2008, and as she was getting ready to start publishing the first of these books, she was at a really desperate point in her life. She describes it and says, "I had failed on an epic scale. An exceptionally short-lived marriage had imploded, and I was jobless, a lone parent, and as poor as it is possible to be in modern Britain without being homeless." She's on the verge of homelessness. "But," she added, "I began to direct all my energy into finishing the only work that mattered to me. Had I really succeeded at anything else, I might never have found the determination to succeed in the one area, writing, in which I believed I truly belonged." In short, she said, her successes were built on her failures. And I've quoted her here as saying in another place, "Rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life." She's one who would tell you in hindsight, "I'm grateful that I got to that point of desperation because I finally knew what it was I felt I was supposed to be doing." So in the story of Jonah up to this point, if you watch his movement in the story, the only thing that he's done is descend. The first command that comes to him is to go up. God says, "Get up and go to Nineveh," but instead he goes down to Joppa. He finds a boat and he gets down into the boat, and once he's in the boat, he gets down into the lower level of the boat when the storm hits. And of course, as the storm comes and things get nasty, eventually he gets down out of the boat as he's tossed into the water, and then he goes down into the belly of this great fish. And in his poetry, in his language that we're looking at today, he talks about the way he sunk down to the pit, to death itself, to the roots of the mountains. And he says in his mind, he is every bit as good as dead. So our text for today is Jonah's prayer from the inside of this fish. And I'll just confess openly, I really don't know exactly how this works. You know, I've never had the experience that, like, if you're roughhousing with some other kids in a swimming pool and they've dunked your head under the water and, you know, they hold you under a little too long where you're really struggling. I have never once in my life come up and said, you know, while I was almost drowning, I composed this Shakespearean sonnet I'd like to share with you, right? So he has this beautiful, articulate prayer. I kind of imagine myself that maybe this is him thinking about all his thoughts, and maybe he's put it in a nice form for us after the fact so that we can enjoy it. But, you know, God can do whatever God wants to do. But Jonah has this beautiful prayer that he prays from the belly of the fish. I'd like to just walk through this passage with you for a couple of minutes. It says in Jonah chapter 2 and verse 1, "From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, 'In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry.'" You know, something I had never considered before. I ran across one commentator who took an angle on this that I'd never considered. I've always talked about the story of Jonah and said he came really, really close to dying but survived in the fish. They point out that in Jonah's own language, he talks about himself as if he actually died. When you think about the way that Jesus invokes this passage in Jonah, the 3 days that Jonah spends, the 3 days and nights that Jonah spends in the belly of the fish, and Jesus compares it to his own moment of resurrection, they said it makes it an even more potent comparison if we're talking about someone who did actually go down to the pit. So I don't know if he's speaking poetically here, saying, I was on the verge of death. Some would say maybe he did actually pass away, and this was a resurrection story. Again, the first time I'd ever seen that. I thought that was an interesting take on this. But he says, "From the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths." He's seeing God at work through the hands of those mariners, right? Because it was them who threw him over the boat. But he says, really, this is the work of God in my life. "You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me." It's a hopeless picture, like being buried alive. And he says in verse 4, "I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple." The significance of the temple for someone like Jonah is that there in the temple you have the Ark of the Covenant and you've got the mercy seat. It was this place on the Ark of the Covenant where God's presence was dwelling. So when they talk about turning their face toward the temple or their prayer reaching the temple, really it's a way of saying that my prayer reached the presence of God. I'm going to turn my face again towards the presence of God where God would hear me. Verse 5, "The engulfing waters threatened me, the deep surrounded me, seaweed was wrapped around my head." What a picture. What a picture. "To the roots of the mountains I sank down." In his mind, that's the lowest place you can go on the earth. "The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord." Any time in Scripture you see someone talking in a context like this about vowing vows and making good on their vows, this is usually one of those exchanges where you tell God, if you'll just do this for me, here's what I'll do for you. And so he's making it clear that I've been begging God to save my life, and in exchange for God saving my life, redeeming my life, I'm going to make good on those vows and do for God the things that I promised I would do for him. And then it says this interesting passage in verse 10, "And the Lord commanded the fish," or spoke to the fish, "and it vomited Jonah onto dry ground." I don't know what God said to that fish, but it must have been pretty gross. But he speaks to the fish, and the fish vomits him onto the dry ground. There's this important statement at the end of his prayer. Salvation comes from the Lord. This is the grand realization of all that prayer, all the things he's sorting through. I'm here on the verge of death. I'm as good as dead. I've been barred into the deep. I have no hope. But salvation comes from the Lord. And it's when he expresses that thought that God speaks to the fish, and the fish spews him out onto the dry ground, and things start to get better. Because we haven't seen dry ground in a while in this story. He's stabilized. He's open to God. He's getting his footing again, and now perhaps he has a place to stand. Sometimes when I'm trying to work through a bigger passage of Scripture and wrap my mind around it, I don't know if you've ever experimented with Japanese poetry called haikus. You know what a haiku is? I made a haiku about this prayer in Jonah just to help me kind of wrap my mind around it. Prayer from inside a fish. Banished from your sight, seaweed wrapped around my head, still my prayer arose. I like that thought. I was in a hopeless place. I couldn't see any way out of it. I was miserable, seaweed wrapped around me, and yet, even from that place, God was listening and God heard my cry. I'm out of sight, perhaps, but not out of God's reach. It would be easy to pause at this point in the story and say, isn't it great? Jonah prayed to God, God saved him, and we know he is going to go this time, and he is actually going to make good on what he's supposed to do and go preach to Nineveh. It seems like everything's kind of fine at this point, but is it really? Because there is still a problem with Jonah. Did you catch it as you read through Jonah's prayer? You know, just because something is written in poetry or because it's beautifully written doesn't mean everything about it is correct. There are some aspects about what's going on in Jonah's heart that are laid bare, even in the way that he prays from this rock bottom moment in his life. He's prayed eloquently and God has responded mercifully. But do you notice in Jonah's prayer that there is not really a full expression of guilt or remorse? Now, he's desperate. He wants to be saved, but he doesn't actually say, you know, God, it is really right for you to want to bring salvation to Nineveh. God, I'm really, really sorry for the things that I've done. Maybe he felt them, but he doesn't express them all that clearly in the prayer. His repentance, some would say, is a bit anemic here. He wants to live like any of us would. I want someone to save me from the belly of this fish, but he doesn't really talk about a change of heart, and that's revealed when you notice there's this twist at the end, like he's busy trying not to die, and the thing he's thinking about is the way idolaters are so much less than he is. Those people who follow worthless idols, they forfeit the love of God, they forfeit the grace that could be theirs. As you read Jonah's prayer, even from inside the belly of the fish, I'm reminded of Luke chapter 18, where Jesus talks about two men who went one time to pray. It says one was a Pharisee, one was a tax collector, and if you remember, who's the one who went away justified? It was the tax collector, not the one anyone expected in that story. He won't even come near the place where he's supposed to pray, but instead he stays a distance. It says he starts pounding on his chest, just saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Have mercy on me. He doesn't feel himself worthy of anything and is just desperate, begging for God to give him mercy. Jesus says a person with a heart like that goes away justified. But the Pharisee prays a different prayer, doesn't he? God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers. And he points at that guy. I mean, he's so blind to this. Even that tax collector. God, I'm grateful that I'm not like him, and I bet you're happy to have me. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all that I get. He's feeling good about himself. But did you catch a hint of that in what Jonah prayed? Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. They forfeit the grace that could be theirs, and he starts kind of pointing, but I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. So in this scenario, Jonah, even from that terrible position he's in, he's judging their idols without being able to see his own idol. Do you see that? He's continuing to judge their idols without being able to see his own. He's awfully proud of the fact that he's an Israelite. He's a Jew, the chosen people of God. It's easy to forget that they're only able to benefit from God's mercy. The only reason they are a people at all, that they got out of slavery and had a promised land to live in and had a kingdom. These are all acts of mercy from God, not anything that they had merited. So what Jonah is failing to see in this situation is that he needs the grace of God just as badly as those Ninevites did. But he's still able to talk in such a way that he's disparaging towards them. So even though it would be true to say that God has shown him grace and mercy, and he's grateful that his life has been saved, what we see in the story, especially as it continues, is that God still has some work to do on Jonah's heart. He's still having some heart issues that he hasn't finished working through. In reflecting on this passage, Timothy Keller wrote some thoughts that I think are pretty good in describing what our culture is like. Because we have a similar struggle to what Jonah had. Jonah wanted to look down on other people, but he didn't want to acknowledge that he himself was a sinner in need of the grace of God. And it wasn't just that his life needed saving, but really his heart needed changing. Sin is an ugly word to use in our culture. I thought this quote from Keller was very poignant. He says, "We are taught that our problem is a lack of self-esteem, that we live with too much shame and self-incrimination. In addition, we are told, all moral standards are socially constructed and relative, so no one has the right to make you feel guilty. You must determine right or wrong for yourself. In a society dominated by such beliefs, the Bible's persistent message that we are guilty sinners comes across as oppressive, if not evil and dangerous. These modern cultural themes make the offer of grace unnecessary, even an insult." So if you see yourself as already a good enough person, already someone who's totally worth saving and someone that God would just be lucky to have, and someone says, you're a sinner in need of the grace of God, you need to have your life redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ, the offer of grace to that mindset feels unnecessary, perhaps even insulting. But the truth is, we are desperately in need of the grace of God. And it's so dangerous when we give into that mindset that lets us think that somehow, I am a little bit better than someone who knows less than I do. I'm better somehow than someone who has less than I do, because it must be because of how good I am that I'm so successful and have what I have, not just the grace of God who's enabled me to do the things that I can do. It's easy to look down on someone who has obeyed with less perfection than I have. And even though I might say, well, sure, I've sinned, but I've got my act together a lot better than they do. It's easy to always jump into those pair of shoes and start pointing at the other people. But yet throughout Scripture, there is constantly this theme of reminding us that apart from the grace of God, which saves us and redeems our heart, we are every bit as helpless as Jonah was down in the belly of that fish. I really don't like this verse in Isaiah, which means I probably need to hear it, where Isaiah says, God's goodness and holiness is so overwhelming, is so magnificent, that even our righteousness, he says, is like filthy rags. I don't want anybody to tell me that the best I can offer, the best I can do, I like to think it's amazing and I'm impressive, but compared to the goodness and the grace of God, even our righteousness, Isaiah says, even our righteousness is like filthy rags. What's that like? I think it must be something like sitting there on a beach covered in fish vomit saying, if God didn't decide to save me, I wouldn't have a chance. I've got nothing to offer. I've got nothing I could have done on my own. I couldn't have overcome the situations that I'm in, but this is God's world, and through God's salvation, God's purposes are going to carry the day. So at this point in the story, Jonah has taken an important step, hasn't he? He's at least committed to God that because you've saved my life and you didn't just snuff me out, I am going to make good on my vows. You've told me to preach to Nineveh, as we're going to see. He will go and he will preach to Nineveh. But he's still not had his heart fully changed. One of my favorite passages in Scripture is a rather strange one in Mark's Gospel, in Mark chapter 8. It's a story of a healing that only Mark's Gospel talks about, and it's a little bit hard to know what to do with. It says in Mark 8 in verse 22, "They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, 'Do you see anything?' He looked up and said, 'I see people. They look like trees walking around.' Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly." It's a weird healing story, isn't it? When you think about the power of Jesus and you see this one occasion where Jesus kind of healed him and he actually had to be touched a second time before everything was restored the way that it needed to be, I think we'd make a mistake in this story to fixate on the power of Jesus as if there's a problem there. Because could he heal the man? Well, of course he could, and he did. But that healing of needing to be touched a second time is, to me, a hopeful picture of my own situation. Because I've often been a blind person, haven't you? There's some things I should have seen that I didn't see. There's some ways that my eyes have been closed that needed to be open. And as much as I'd like to think that I only needed one encounter with God and then I pretty much had it from there, it's just not true, is it? I mean, I wish it were the case that I had only needed to hear the Sermon on the Mount once in my life, and from there, I could just act it out and behave perfectly. I wish I could have only repented of my sins one time and just gotten it all correct from there and not needed any more repentance. I wish I could say that I perfectly understood everything about the Bible, having only read through it one time, and I just got it from there. But the truth is, we kind of continue to need God's help, don't we? Even as he tries to teach us one time in life, even if it's a rock bottom type experience, we might gain some truth, but there's still room for growth. Jonah had begun to repent. He's glad to be alive. He's doing better now than he was in round one of God's request. But we're going to see that Jonah still has a need for more patience from God. And the good news of this story is that God wasn't done with him yet. God's grace is a surprising thing. He wasn't just loving enough to redeem his life and give him another chance at life, but even with Jonah's imperfect obedience after the fact, God is still willing to walk with him, to keep asking him questions, to keep giving him more than just a second chance. It isn't just a second chance that we need. It's for God to keep helping us. Even after we might have had a rock bottom experience and got ourselves moving in a better direction, we're still imperfect in our understanding. We need a God who continues to love us and give us mercy, that second touch and third touch and fourth touch, as he keeps shaping us into the servants he's trying to help us to become. God's grace is a wonderful and marvelous thing, and Jonah was right to say that salvation comes from the Lord. He's the only one to whom we can turn when we need our lives to be redeemed from the sin that's present in them, when we need a Savior, when we need someone to guide us in a better path. As you reflect on your own life this morning, maybe there's some way that, kind of like Jonah, you've had some level of repentance and some dedication, but you recognize you just haven't gotten there yet, and you need God to give you more help. Maybe we could be praying for you this morning. Maybe you're a person who's never really repented and you've never turned to God the first time, and this morning you'd like to be baptized, you'd like to become a Christian, you'd like to make a commitment to God. Whatever your needs are this morning, this is a time that you can talk to us as a church family. We'll be happy to receive you and to do whatever we can. We invite you to come forward as together we stand and sing this song.